They cracked the world open with laughter, long before punchlines came with applause signs, and before bloopers became branding. These weren't just comedians. They were craftsmen of chaos, architects of absurdity, and kings of timing. Behind the curtains of black and white celluloid, a war was always being waged, against pain, against formality, against the silence of an America on edge. And in that war, the weapon was wit. Some were vaudeville veterans with bodies made of rubber and faces that could fold into 30 emotions in one blink. Others? Quiet assassins of the straight line, slipping zingers like daggers into conversations dressed as casual banter. But every one of them, every single one, left something hysterically human behind. Today we walk into the green rooms, gin-soaked dressing tables, and backstage whispers of the actors who didn't just make Hollywood funny, they made it immortal. This is the untold, emotional, riotously real story of Golden Age Hollywood's funniest actors and the glorious chaos they left behind. Chapter 1. A chronological launch into comedy's golden dynasty. The 1920s to 1930s is when the funny began with silence. Before sound could save a joke, laughter lived in the body. Enter Buster Keaton. A child vaudevillian born into pratfalls and raised in a traveling family act known as the Three Keatons, Buster had a face carved from granite, but a soul made of mischief. He was the great stone face, never cracking a smile on screen yet making millions erupt in laughter. In films like Sherlock Jr. and The General, Keaton didn't just fall off buildings or get hit by trains. He engineered every frame himself, often risking his life. There was no green screen. That house really collapsed around him. That water tower really knocked him flat. And through it all, he never flinched. But off-screen, Buster was heartbreak wrapped in silence. He drank too much, loved too deeply, and when talkies took over, his career, along with his marriage, nearly drowned. Yet even as MGM turned him into a gag writer rather than a star, Keaton never lost the impulse to make us laugh, if only to keep from crying. Then came Harold Lloyd. Not as silent, not as sad, but just as daring. If Keaton was marble, Lloyd was mirror, a reflection of America's optimistic hustle. Known for his round spectacles and underdog charm, Lloyd hung from clock towers in 1923's Safety Last and ran from disasters with a comedic rhythm that was pure jazz. But here's the thing. He lost a thumb and forefinger in a prop explosion during a photo shoot. Yet you'd never know. He wore a prosthetic glove and kept climbing, running, swinging. He had that Midwestern invincibility, and his comedy was less about existential collapse and more about winning the girl and the job through pure charm and chaos. While Chaplin went for sentiment and Keaton chased surrealism, Lloyd embodied the crowd pleaser. He made over 200 films, lived to 77, and died a millionaire, a rarity among the tragedy-riddled crowd of silent-era comics. The 1930s to 1940s gave us the rise of the wordsmiths. The moment sound came in, so did the real assassins of laughter. You could hear them now, and they had a lot to say. Enter the Marx Brothers, Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo. Together they were a cyclone of nonsense that bent logic until it snapped. Groucho's grease-paint mustache and staccato one-liners made him the verbal sniper of Hollywood. I never forget a face, but in your case I'll be glad to make an exception. That was Groucho. Cutting, inappropriate, perfect. Harpo, the mute chaos agent, communicated in honks, harp solos, and havoc. Chico played the Italian stereotype with piano skills to match. Their films, like Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera, were anarchic symphonies where plot was optional and dialogue was a weapon. Behind the scenes, they were equally absurd. Groucho was acidic and brilliant but melancholic in private. Harpo was the quietest in interviews but the most loyal friend in a scandal. Chico, a gambling addict who lost fortunes and charmed his way through every debt with that same crooked grin. They made laughter feel like rebellion, and they never played it safe. Chapter 2. The Comedy of Contradictions, 1940s to 50. In this period, we witness the rise of the drunken philosopher of vaudeville. Enter W.C. Fields. If comedy is tragedy plus time, then W.C. Fields was both the formula and the result. Born William Claude Dukenfield in 1880, Fields was a juggler first. He toured the globe with his act, barely speaking. But when he did speak, later in the talkies, it was with a rasping, cynical slur that sounded like whiskey arguing with sarcasm. Fields played the same character over and over, the lovable misanthrope. The man who hated children, distrusted women, and preferred his drink shaken, stirred, and never-ending. Films like It's a Gift and The Bank Dick featured no plot, just Fields slurring through surreal, oddly touching chaos. Off-screen, he was the character but more tragic. An alcoholic who kept vodka in his thermos and often ad-libbed lines just to amuse himself. He lived in fear of sobriety. Yet within that fog, he held profound comedic instincts. A man who made an art of indifference, turning loathing into laughs. Then came Bob Hope, the eternal entertainer. Bob Hope didn't need tragedy to be funny. He needed a microphone, a tuxedo, and someone to take a jab at. He was Hollywood's safest comic, charming, topical, and fast. With his ski-slope nose and machine gun delivery, Hope wasn't physical like Keaton or chaotic like the Marx Brothers. He was wit in a tailored suit. And when he teamed with Bing Crosby in the Road to series, he brought improvisation and wink-wink self-awareness into mainstream studio films. Hope also did something rare. He stayed beloved. He entertained troops from World War II to Vietnam, hosted the Oscars 19 times, and made his comedic rhythm part of America's heartbeat. But his ambition was legendary, and backstage, his comedic persona often masked a ruthless pursuit of fame and staying power. He was funny. He was slick. But he was also a businessman, a comic who knew the best jokes were also brand-building. Then came Danny Kaye, the shapeshifter of joy. Then there was the chameleon, the one who could sing, dance, speak mock Russian, do 6 characters in one breath, and make it look like joy poured out of his skin. Danny Kaye wasn't just funny, he was dazzling. In films like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty and The Court Jester, Kaye didn't just act, he exploded. He bounced off walls, threw his limbs like they weren't attached, and slipped into fantasy worlds without ever losing the audience. His tongue-twisting, maladjusted jester sequence, still a masterclass in speed and showmanship. But behind the magic was an intense, sometimes insecure perfectionist. His wife, Sylvia Fine, wrote most of his best material, and Kaye, despite his brightness, often walked a tightrope of emotional control. He feared failure, feared being ordinary, yet he never showed it on screen. On screen, he was happiness personified. Then came Abbott and Costello, the Laurel and Hardy of wartime America, straight man and clown, setup and punchline. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello were the perfect comic marriage, and like most marriages, it was complicated. Their routines were polished to glass, timing so tight it defied gravity. Who's on first? Isn't just a bit, it's cultural furniture. Their films, like Buck Privates and Hold That Ghost, were part of America's war relief, providing laughter when headlines were soaked in blood. But their real story was heartbreak. In 1943, Costello suffered a devastating personal loss when his infant son drowned in the family swimming pool. Just days later, still shattered by grief, he insisted on performing, delivering laughs to a live radio audience while weeping between takes backstage. That same year, he also suffered a serious attack of rheumatic fever, compounding his physical and emotional pain. Abbott, meanwhile, struggled with epilepsy using comedy as camouflage. Despite their chemistry, off-camera their friendship frayed. Fights over money, over billing, over pain, neither could quite voice. By the mid-1950s, their magic and their partnership crumbled. Yet they left behind a rhythm that defined the era. When America laughed in the 1940s, it often did so in unison, with Costello's squeaky panic and Abbott's deadpan calm leading the charge. Intermission. We ask ourselves, what is the cost of comedy? For all their laughs, these actors bore the bruises of joy. Keaton broke his neck and didn't know it for years. Fields drank himself into reclusion. Costello buried a child and bled behind the scenes. And Danny Kaye? He feared being forgotten almost as much as he feared standing still. Because funny, in the golden age, didn't come from jokes. It came from urgency, from proving something, from escaping something. Laughter was survival, and timing, in more ways than one, was everything. Chapter 3. The Twilight Tricksters, 1950s to early 60s. Enter Red Skelton, the clown with a poet's soul. Red Skelton was proof that the silliest faces often mask the softest hearts. Born into poverty, his father died before he was born, and Skelton's childhood was a cocktail of hardship and traveling circuses. But from that wandering life came a profound gift. Character. Not just jokes, characters. He created a whole universe. Freddie the Freeloader, Clem Cadiddlehopper, Junior the Mean Whittle Kid, silly on the outside, deeply human underneath. Red didn't need the audience to laugh at his characters. He wanted them to feel for them. His 1950s variety show wasn't just a hit. It was a sacred ritual for post-war families. And yet, like all clowns, Skelton suffered behind his painted smile. In 1958, his 9-year-old son died of leukemia, and the loss cracked something in Red that never quite healed. He spoke of it rarely, but you could see the shadows in the timing, the pauses, the prayerfulness behind the pratfalls. He continued performing into his 70s, often ending shows in tears, his own and the audience's. Because by then we all knew, Red wasn't just being funny. He was saying goodbye to something. Then came Jack Benny, the master of the pause. Timing. Jack Benny didn't just have it. He invented it. On radio, in film, and later on television, Jack Benny was the king of the delayed punch, the long, breathless pause. The look to the audience that said, "Can you believe this?" He turned vanity into comedy gold, always pretending to be 39 years old, always pretending to be broke, always the butt of his own joke. And yet, he wasn't. Benny was generous to a fault, often giving his cast the best lines. He let Rochester, his black valet, steal scenes at a time when that was unthinkable in mainstream media. He trusted his team, loved them. His rivalry with Fred Allen was legendary and completely fake, a brilliant act of long-form comedic kayfabe that kept audiences invested for decades. He never raised his voice, never flailed, and yet every room bent toward his silence. Off-screen, Benny was a gentleman, a violinist, a quiet romantic devoted to his wife Mary Livingstone. And when he died in 1974, a single red rose was delivered to her bedside every day for years after, because he'd arranged for that in his will. Jack Benny made understatement into theater, and comedy into legacy. Then came Jerry Lewis, the torn hurricane. Then there was Jerry Lewis. If Skelton was sentiment, Benny restraint, then Lewis was pure animal. He was chaos on two legs, a screaming, twitching, bouncing cartoon who made the frame quake. But beneath the mugging and madness was a childlike vulnerability that made him irresistible. With Dean Martin, he formed one of the most electrifying duos in entertainment. Martin was cool, crooning indifference. Lewis was purid, tripping over himself, screaming "lady," and destroying everything in sight. Their chemistry was electric and doomed. By 1956, their partnership imploded. Lewis wanted to direct, to control, to say something. Martin wanted to keep things simple. Their split was so bitter they didn't speak for 20 years. Alone, Jerry became something more complicated. He made The Nutty Professor, a masterpiece of self-loathing and duality, and launched telethons for muscular dystrophy that raised over $2 billion, but his need for control, his volatility and ego often alienated friends and collaborators. He was brilliant. He was exhausting. He was, at heart, still the lonely boy trying to make his mother laugh in a Brooklyn tenement. Intermission, acknowledging the unseen thread. All these men, whether hurling pies or whispering punchlines, were drawing from the same well. Pain, timing, and the deep human ache to matter. They could make people laugh until they cried, but few ever saw how often the laughter came from their own tears. Keaton, with his broken body. Fields, with his war against sobriety. Benny, with his silences. Skelton, with his grief. Lewis, with his loneliness. Comedy was never just jokes. It was defiance. And they, the jesters of Hollywood's golden court, wore crowns made of rubber and regret. Chapter 4. The Legacy They Left Laughing. As the 60s gave way to New Hollywood, many of these actors aged out of the spotlight, not because they lost their talent, but because the world stopped listening the same way. Slapstick faded, vaudeville evaporated, irony crept in like a fog. But the blueprint they built, the rhythms, the rules, the reverence for timing, remained indelible. They became myths in motion, teaching tools, ghosts of laughter. Groucho Marx, in his final years, became a national treasure and a cult icon. His sharpness never dulled. In one of his last interviews, he said, "I intend to live forever or die trying." He died in 1977, 3 days after Elvis. But in many ways, he had lived forever. Jack Benny's radio archives are still studied by modern comics like a symphony of silence. Johnny Carson, Steve Martin, Jerry Seinfeld, all of them borrowed Benny's pause, his arched brow, his artful restraint. When Benny passed, Bob Hope said, "He left us laughing. What more can one ask?" Jerry Lewis, in his late years, became the blueprint for the comedian as auteur. French critics revered him as a genius. Americans remained divided, but few would argue that his fingerprints weren't all over the DNA of Jim Carrey, Robin Williams, and beyond. Painful, polarizing, but unforgettable. Red Skelton, who continued to perform in theaters long after TV turned its back, once told a crowd, "If some of you see yourselves in my characters, it's because I see all of you in me." He didn't just want to entertain, he wanted to connect. And even in death, he did. Lou Costello, who never truly recovered from the loss of his son, is still the soft, sweet panic behind every lovable fool we root for. Every sitcom misstep. Every wide-eyed, bumbling dreamer. Epilogue. A brief and reflective close. They say tragedy and comedy are siblings, twins even, and in Golden Age Hollywood that was always true. The funniest actors in the world were often the most bruised. Their jokes were balm, their routines armor, their personas carefully curated masks that slipped off only behind closed dressing room doors, yet they never stopped. Because the world needed their laughter, and in some buried place, they needed it too. They weren't telling jokes, they were telling the truth in disguise. And what they left behind was more than celluloid or catchphrases. They left behind the pause before the punchline, the hope behind the sarcasm, the tear behind the grin. They taught us that funny doesn't mean frivolous, and that the loudest laugh can often echo from the darkest corner. This was the real curtain call of Golden Age comedy. Not the joke, but the human behind it. Still funny, still aching, still here,